She said you haven't turned on.
Are we on now? No.
Yes.
Well, first I'd like to thank Vicky for inviting me to speak here today and for this wonderful introduction. So thank you, Vicky. One may ask, why after all these decades do we want to inflict these unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust on the human mind? Why bring back these visions of death, brutality, and inhumanity? The philosopher George Santayana once says, quote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to relive it," end quote. And this does not have to happen just to the Jewish people. We Jews do not have a monopoly of being persecuted. It can happen to any minority. Over the decades, how often did we pick up the paper and we read about an ethnic cleansing attempt someplace or other? And that's exactly what Hitler wanted. He wanted a world to be Judenrein, literally translated, meant clean of Jews. One may also ask, why did it take the Jewish community so long after the war, before they established a day to remember and memorialize the 6 million men, women, and children who were so brutally executed because the crime that they have committed was having been born Jewish? I think because it took us survivors that long to be able to put our arms around this enormous tragedy that befell us. I think it took me about 15 years, or maybe more, after the war, before I was able to talk about it. I became an expert, a master of making up stories as to who I was, where I came from, why I spoke with an accent, anything but the truth. I was so good at it that I lived with the same 3 men through 4 years of dental school. And it was not until after we graduated and they were invited to our wedding that they learned the true identity of their roommate Hersch. Even my own children, during their growing years, knew very little, if anything, about their father's past, because it was not a subject talked about in our house. I don't think that they even realized that they had another set of grandparents, because we never talked about them, nor did we have pictures to show them. Furthermore, I think it took the world that long to realize that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not a group of terrorists or a rogue government. It was a nation that prided itself on its culture, and whose culture commanded universal respect. A nation that gave birth to Beethoven and Schiller and Goethe, gave birth to Auschwitz and Dachau and Buchenwald. Murder factories where thousands of people who died daily, and their bodies were burned in the giant crematoria. And the rest of the civilized world stood by silently, saying nothing. Hitler offered Great Britain something like 1 million Jews for 10,000 trucks or something like that. And the British government turned them down, saying, what are we going to do with 1 million Jews? I can't tell you how sad and angry I am, because I can't help but think, what if? What if they had made this deal? My sister Shantje would be one of the million and be alive today. When the SS St. Louis, with 800 German Jews, came to the shores of the United States of America, asking for asylum, and the United States State Department would not let them in. Neither did Cuba, nor any other country within earshot. The ship had to turn around, and 800 innocent men, women, and children went straight to the gas chamber. Can we allow these same nations to lull themselves into forgetfulness? And can we be sure that such atrocities will not happen again. Edmund Burke, a British statesman and author, once said, quote, "All that's necessary for the forces of evil to win in this world is for a lot of good people to say nothing." I was born in Poland. When the war broke out in 1939, Poland was divided between the Soviet Union and Germany. My hometown was first occupied by the Soviets. There was a stream of refugees that came into our town and told about the atrocities that are being perpetrated on the other side. But the Jews in my hometown would say, my parents included, would say, no, this cannot happen. Nobody can perpetrate such terrible things. Besides, we have nothing to worry about because we live amongst friends. They will help us. They will protect us. Why did they turn on their friends? Why did they become so eager and willing to cooperate with the Nazi beast? It was Yom Kippur 1942. It was exactly 1 year since my father was taken away. I got up early that morning. Into the flickering light of a memorial candle, I was reading for the book of Psalms, because I know he liked to do that. My older sister, Rochel, got up even earlier and went outside, because she wanted to be by herself. But no sooner did she leave, she came running back and told us there was an aktia, or a raid going outside. What that meant was that any Jew who was caught during a raid was loaded into a cattle car and shipped off to a concentration camp. With no time to waste, Mother called us together. I had 3 older sisters, by the way. Mother called us all together, and with tears in her eyes, she said, I never thought that this time will come when I'll have to separate my family. But this has to be God's will. She told us that she had made arrangements with a Gentile friend of ours who lived in the outskirts of town, that during the aktia, she will take my younger sister Shansha and me and hide us until after the aktia. And no matter how much we begged and cried, and there was no way to change her mind, she walked us to the door and closed the door behind us. It was really not a big effort for 2 little kids who knew the town well to get out unobserved. Unfortunately, by the time we got to the outskirts, the street was already blocked by the Gestapo. We had to make a quick decision. To turn around, we'll definitely be caught. To go straight ahead, that's right into the hands of the SS. There was a third option. There was an overgrown field running alongside the main road. We thought maybe if we take that field, we'll be able to elude the guards. And we were almost safe. It had not been for this Polish woman who was standing there enjoying herself, watching her neighbors being rounded up like cattle to be taken to the concentration camp, to be taken to the slaughterhouse. She pointed us out to the Gestapo. What kind of a neighbor was that? What kind of a woman was that? How much hatred and prejudice and bigotry was at her heart to send 2 little kids to their death? The soldiers proceeded to take my sister, myself, and about a dozen other Jews back into town. They took us to this large area which had building on 2 sides and SS with machine guns on the other 2. We were ordered to sit on the ground and warned if anybody would stand up, we'll be shot. And as the day progressed, more and more people were brought to the area because we were the early ones, so we were first. And we were pushed further and further until our backs were against the wall. And there I saw it, a little window leading to the basement of one of the buildings. I showed it to my sister, and the two of us tried to pull it open, but not successfully. Then my sister suggested if she were to sit in the front and block us from view, maybe this man who sat next to me, maybe he and I can pull it open. And after a few tries, we did. As soon as people saw the open window, they started sliding down into the basement. I wanted my sister to go first, but she said, no, Hersch, you must go first. Because with our father now dead, and if you don't come home, Mother will have a very hard time of it, and pushed me towards the window. And there I found myself in the darkness of the basement, calling Shansha, Shansha, but all I heard was, shut, be quiet, they may hear you. But none of those voices were my sister's, because she was sitting out there thinking that she was protecting people from sliding down, protecting them from view. Finally, I made my way into the backyard. There was a lumberyard of some kind, and many piles of wood. It seemed like nice hiding places. But by the time I got to any of them, they were already full of people, and people pushed me away and said, go away, little boy, go away, there's no room for you here, go away. There was another pile of lumber way at the far end. I ran to that pile, and there was room there. It was only occupied by one person, an old man, and he too wouldn't let me in. Instead, he pointed at the fence, and in Yiddish he said, Läuf, mein Kind, läuf. Run, my child, run. I don't know how, but I scaled the fence and jumped. No sooner did my feet hit the ground, than two soldiers appeared at the far end of the building. Fortunately for me, there was this Polish woman crossing the street. She attracted their attention, which gave me enough time to run the other way and out of sight. That afternoon, thousands of Jews were loaded into cattle cars and shipped off to the concentration camp, and I never saw my sister again. Over the years, I did not think of my family very much. It was too painful. But when I did, I thought of Shansha. I could imagine how frightened she must have been to have been left alone. How frightened she must have been. She was only 13 or 14 years old. How frightened she must have been to have been loaded into a cattle car with nobody to hold her tight or even hold her hand. But what happened after the door in the cattle car closed, I would not allow myself to think about. And yet there are those out there who say that the Holocaust never happened, that it's nothing more than Jewish propaganda. If you watch the movie Schindler's List, there was a Spielberg movie. There was a scene where a Nazi officer would take the revolver out from his holster and put a bullet through the head of a pregnant woman, and then watch how the freshly fallen snow turned crimson, then pushed the revolver back into his holster and walked away as if nothing ever happened, as if he had just extinguished a candle and not the life of a human being. And those Holocaust deniers claimed that this too could not have happened. No Nazi officer would commit such a heinous crime. It was nothing more than Spielberg's brilliant imagination. It was in the winter of 1943. My mother, my two sisters, and I lived in the ghetto. We had aktias off and on, but they were small ones, and the people would build hiding places, like boarding off a room or something like that. But pretty soon the Germans became very astute as to where those hiding places were, and they also brought dogs to smell their victims. Mother made arrangements with the farmer on the outskirts of town and with the nearby village, that if there is that major aktia which was expected to happen, that she will that he will come and pick us up under the cover of darkness and take us to his farm and hide us until after the Aktion. One day, 3 truckloads of soldiers came into town in a lot of cars to our railroad station, which was certainly an indication that a big Aktion is about to happen. I don't know how, but Mother sent notice to Michal, and under the cover of darkness, he picked us up at his designated place, put us in his sleigh, covered us with hay, and took us to his farm. There, he built a very ingenious hiding place in his barn. It was just barely wide enough for the 4 of us to lie side by side or sit up, but not high enough to stand up. But that was actually an advantage, because it was very cold and we needed the body heat. As predicted, 2 days later, a major Aktion occurred and thousands of people from my hometown were shipped off to the concentration camps. After the dust settled, Mother said, well, we have to go back into town because Michal's race for this accommodation was quite high, and the accommodation itself was less than desirable, lying on the straw on the ground. But she said, we will split up again. That she and I will go first, and then my 2 sisters will follow the following night. Again, Michal put us in the sleigh, covered us with the hay, and took us to the same place where he picked us up, and we successfully snuck back into our building, expecting my 2 sisters the next day. When the sun rose and they were not there, we knew that something had happened. Mother risked her life, ran out of the ghetto, or right into the farmer's market. And there she did not have to ask any questions, because all the farmers talked about was those 2 beautiful Jewish girls who were this morning shot in Michal's front lawn. How much strength does a person need to be able to take such news and survive? She went back into the ghetto, waving her hands in the breeze, but never made our building collapse on the street. We picked her up, brought her back into the house, and put her to bed, where she stayed for the rest of the day. In the dusk, she called me over. In a very audible voice, she said, Herschel, I'm not much longer for this world. I have to go and be with your father and your sisters. Aunt Shandel, Mother's sister, Aunt Shandel will take good care of you. But promise me that you'll grow up to be a good boy and a good Jew. And her head fell back onto the pillow. She stayed there for the next few days, but yet she would get up early every morning and go to the window, hoping this is nothing but a nightmare, that her children will still come back to her. But when reality finally set in, the only wish she had was to bring the children back to the cemetery, so she can give them a Jewish funeral, something she couldn't give her husband or her youngest daughter. She found somebody who was willing to go and exhume their bodies at night, bring them back to the cemetery. She bribed the authorities for permits to be able to leave the ghetto during the day. But when the time came to leave, Mother said to me, no, you stay home. That is not a sight for your eyes. And they left. I stood at the window watching them leave the ghetto. And when they were out of sight, I gave them some extra time to give them a head start. Then I bundled up and left the house. It was not very difficult for a little boy to find the cemetery that particular morning, because the soldiers were going from building to building, both German and Ukrainian soldiers. And if they found somebody in the bed with a temperature, they would shoot, claiming they're preventing a disease was spreading, like they needed an excuse. The body was then taken out and put into a sleigh, which was in the front of the building. And when that sleigh was full, 2 Jewish men would pull it to the cemetery and literally throw the bodies into a mass grave, leaving a trail of blood behind them. All I had to do was follow the trail of blood. And when I got to the cemetery, it was not very difficult to find the grave either. Because all I had to do was follow the sound of a crying woman who was about to bury her 2 children. And when I reached the grave, there was a sight that stayed with me for a very long time. I saw a woman, a grieving woman, my mother, who in the matter of a year and a half lost her husband, her youngest daughter, and about to bury 2 more of her children. And all she wanted to do was jump into the grave with them. It took 2 men to hold her back. And it was there that I saw the frozen bodies of my 2 sisters, each with a bullet hole in her head, inflicted by a Nazi officer. That was not Spielberg's imagination. I can't possibly cover the magnitude of the Holocaust. It's an event unparalleled in human history, in statistics so numbing that they defy comprehension. But it would be remiss if I were not to mention there were some good people. There were some good men and women, though very few in number, who risked their lives and that of their families to save total strangers like myself. A few years ago, my wife and I went back to Poland because we wanted to see the farmer who hid me out the last few months of the war. I particularly wanted to see his children, who were my age at the time, and I wanted to thank them, now as adults, for their courage to be able to keep such a secret that there was a little Jewish boy hiding in their attic. And while we were in Poland, we decided to go to Auschwitz. And no matter how much I've read and pictures seen of Auschwitz, it was not until I was actually there that I was able to comprehend the magnitude of human destruction that took place there. I can't put into words how I felt when I first saw those infamous railroad tracks converging on the small little gate with a deceptive inscription above it, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes free. And when I walked through this gate, I had to touch it. I had to make sure that it was real. That through this gate, 3 million men, women, and children went through. And only a few handfuls came back out alive. How do you put into words when you see a room with a pile of human hair on the glass, estimated to weigh 7 tons? Because the Germans would shave the heads of their victims before they put them into their gas chamber. They didn't mind the smell of human flesh, but somehow they minded the smell of human hair. How do you describe the pain one feels when you see a room full of baby shoes, thousands and thousands of baby shoes, whose owners once wore them with pride, but had to take them off because their last few steps into the gas chamber was barefoot? Or pictures, which were the end result of experiments conducted by Nazi physicians on human beings, distorted human beings. That was more than I can take. And I told my wife that I'd like to leave. But on the way out, this woman opened what seemed like a concealed door, and in Polish she said, "Tutaj proszę," and here, please. We hesitated for a minute and went in. It was a dimly lit room, and in the center there was an illuminated crypt, and in that crypt there was the Star of David, surrounded by broken pieces of marble. And as we were looking into that crypt, Out of the dark corner came the chanting of Eid Malei Rachamim Shochein B'Marmim. The prayer we Jews recite for our dead, which translates, O Heavenly God who lives up on high and are full of compassion. With that, I could no longer contain myself, and I started to cry. Where did I say, can I get the strength and the faith to say, O Heavenly God who lives up on high and are full of compassion, in a place where 3 million of my brothers were so brutally murdered? And when my face wet with tears, I walked out of the building. My wife followed in a few minutes. No words passed between us as we walked the streets of Auschwitz. No, the fence was no longer electrified. There were no more guards on the towers with machine guns. There were no more living skeletons in the bunks, but their ghosts were all around us. And then we came upon a little sign, gas with an arrow, a little sign with an arrow saying gas chamber and crematorium number 1. I developed such severe palpitations that I thought I was having a heart attack. Well, they passed, and we continued our walk. And when we reached the iron door leading into the gas chamber, it took me a few minutes before I had enough courage to go inside. Once in was an innocently looking room. It was meant to look like a shower room in a large gymnasium. But I knew that the spigots in the ceiling did not come hot and cold water, but cyclone number 2, the deadliest of poisonous gases developed by Nazi chemists for just this reason. And as I stood there, I wondered how many thousands of people stood in this very same place that I was standing. But they did not breathe the air that I was breathing. They were breathing cyclone number 2. And as I looked around the room, in my mind's eye I can picture naked stranger embracing naked stranger. And with their last breath, they were saying Shema Yisrael, the cry the armadas of old were crying when they were tortured and burned and killed in the name of their faith. But those iron doors were shut so tightly that neither God nor man could hear or wanted to hear. And in that moment, all I wanted to shout was, God, oh God, why did you desert us? But then when I entered the adjoining room, which was the crematorium, and I saw a row of ovens. And in my mind's eye, I can picture those large flames engulfing those naked bodies, who just moments before were sacrificed because of their faith. I was sure more than ever that no matter how much mental anguish it may cause me, it is my duty and my obligation to go out and in my own way, my own little way, make sure that the world never forgets. Because history has a way of softening tragedy and grief and dull the rough edges of pain, even if inflicted on a monumental scale. Future generations will be better served if we take time now to keep the truth. Before my wife and I moved to Arizona, we lived in Boston, Massachusetts. There is a memorial, a Holocaust memorial, right on the Freedom Trail. And the reason it was put on the Freedom Trail because it's thought that the Holocaust was not just a Jewish story or a German story. It's a human story, and it should be on the Freedom Trail. And there is a plaque with a quote by a German Lutheran minister who spent several years in the concentration camp, but by some miracle survived. And I'd like to share with you what that plaque says. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the tradesmen. I did not speak up because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me. And by that time, there was no one left to speak up. All that is necessary for the forces of evil to win in this world is for a lot of good people